My name is Clara. For a long time, that was just a fact, a label, like the return address on an envelope. It didn't feel like it belonged to me. I was Leo's wife, a resident of the grand, ivy-draped house on Camellia Lane in Port Blossom, a city that prized appearances above all else. Our life, from the outside, was a portrait of Southern grace, a restored colonial home with a sprawling porch, Sunday brunches at the yacht club, and a marriage that looked as polished as the silverware we used for company. But a portrait is just a surface, and beneath the varnish, the canvas was beginning to fray. This story, my story, is not one of revenge. It's a story of reclamation. It's about how I found my own name again, and the quiet, unshakable strength that had been living inside me all along, waiting for the silence to fall so it could finally be heard. The unraveling didn't begin with a bang, but with a whisper, a series of small, almost imperceptible tears in the fabric of my life. It started with laughter. It was always laughter. "Clara, darling, don't you think that dress is a bit ambitious?" Leo would say, his voice a smooth, charming drawl at a garden party. He'd frame it as a joke, a playful tease for the benefit of our friends, who would chuckle politely. I would smile, a practiced, gentle curve of my lips, and smooth down the fabric of the dress I'd felt beautiful in only an hour before. Inside, a small, warm light would extinguish. Leo never raised his voice. He was a master of the subtle wound, the kind of injury that leaves no visible mark but festers for days. His words were like perfectly polished stones, smooth and cool to the touch, but heavy enough to sink you. "You're so sensitive, Clara," he'd murmur after I'd shrink from a backhanded compliment about my cooking. "It's just a joke." Or, "I'm only trying to help you," when he'd point out a misplaced book on the shelf just as guests arrived, his tone suggesting a catastrophic failure on my part. Our home on Camellia Lane was his masterpiece of control. It was beautiful, yes, with its wisteria-draped verandas and floors of polished heart pine, but it was also a stage. Every object had its place, every routine its prescribed time. My life became a performance piece, and he was the ever-present director. I learned to anticipate his moods by the way he dropped his briefcase by the door, to measure my words by the tightness around his eyes. My world, once vibrant and filled with my own passions, painting, long walks in the salt marshes, my book club, grew smaller, its edges trimmed to fit the narrow frame he'd built for me. My best friend, Amelia, saw it. Amelia, a sharp-witted attorney with eyes that missed nothing, had been my anchor since we were girls building forts in her backyard. After a dinner party one evening, where Leo had joked about my inability to follow a stock portfolio, she cornered me in the kitchen. "He's hollowing you out, Clara," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I see you trying to fold yourself up so you don't take up too much space." "He's just stressed, Ames," I'd replied, my voice a hollow echo of a defense I no longer believed. "The firm is putting a lot of pressure on him." She just looked at me, her expression a mixture of love and deep sadness. "The world is putting pressure on everyone, Clara. That doesn't give him the right to use you as his emotional punching bag." I had no response. She was right. I felt myself disappearing, my colors fading until I was a pale watercolor wash of the woman I used to be. The calls to my sister, Maya, became less frequent because I didn't know how to explain the quiet ache in my chest without sounding like I was complaining about a life others would envy. The turning point, the moment the whisper became a clear, undeniable sound, happened not in our home, but in the opulent ballroom of the St. James Hotel during the annual Port Blossom Heritage Gala. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and old money. Leo was in his element, gliding through the crowd with a champagne flute in his hand, a charming smile fixed on his face. He had just secured a major partnership for his investment firm, and the night was supposed to be a celebration. As the evening wore on, his charm began to curdle with the alcohol. He leaned in close to me, his breath warm with champagne and contempt. "Look at you," he muttered, his eyes scanning my beaded gown. Always so put together. You know, if I left you, you'd have nothing. You wouldn't even know how to pay the property taxes. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a joke this time. There was no audience, no performative chuckle. It was just a shard of pure, unadulterated cruelty meant only for me. I felt the familiar shame rise, a hot flush creeping up my neck. But this time, something else rose with it. A tiny, defiant spark of anger. When we returned home, the silence in the car was heavy, suffocating. He went straight to the liquor cabinet, pouring a tumbler of bourbon. I watched him, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The fear was still there, but beneath it was a strange, new clarity. I walked over to the mahogany desk in the corner of the study, where he kept the hotel's ridiculously expensive stationery. My hands were shaking, but my voice, when I spoke, was surprisingly steady. "You're always talking about leaving me, Leo," I said, my back to him. "About how I'd be left with nothing." He scoffed into his glass. "It's just talk, Clara. Don't be so dramatic." I turned, holding a crisp sheet of the hotel's letterhead and a fountain pen. "Then this shouldn't be a problem." I walked towards him and placed the paper on the coffee table. "If you're so sure of yourself, and so sure I'm nothing without you, then let's make an agreement. A postnup. Something that says if we ever do part ways, you'll be fair." He stared at me, then threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, ugly sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. "A postnup? Darling, what assets are you bringing to the table?" "Your collection of half-finished paintings." The insult stung, but I didn't let it show. I held his gaze. "It's not about assets, Leo. It's about peace of mind. For me. Indulge me." He was drunk, arrogant, and amused by my audacity. He snatched the pen from my hand. "Fine. What do you want it to say?" "That I'll give you the goddamn garden gnomes." He scribbled a few lines with theatrical flourish, his handwriting a barely legible scrawl. He wrote that in the event of a divorce initiated by him, all shared assets would be split 70/30ths in my favor, including the house, his portfolio, and future earnings for a period of 5 years. He was mocking me, writing down terms so ludicrous he thought it was the punchline to a very long, very sad joke. "There," he said, slamming the pen down. "Happy now?" He signed his name with a flourish at the bottom and shoved the paper at me. "Go on, frame it. A monument to your paranoia." He finished his bourbon, stumbled towards the stairs, and was asleep within minutes. He forgot about it by morning. He never mentioned it again. But I didn't forget. The next day, my hands trembling, I carefully folded that piece of stationery and placed it in a protective sleeve. I called Amelia. "I need you to look at something," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "And I need you to not ask me why." "Not yet." I met her at a quiet cafe far from our usual neighborhood. I slid the document across the table. She read it, her lawyerly eyes scanning the scrawled lines. She read it again. Finally, she looked up at me, and there was no pity in her expression, only a quiet, fierce understanding. "He signed this." I nodded. "And he was sober enough to hold a pen?" "He was drunk," I admitted. "But he knew what he was doing. He was being cruel." Amelia tapped her finger on the paper. "Clara, cruelty can be legally binding." She paused, her gaze intense. "This is a loaded gun. And he just handed it to you." That was the day the performance truly began. With Amelia's guidance, we didn't just file the document away. We fortified it. She helped me draft a formal addendum, clarifying the vague terms, citing state laws, and adding a clause that stated the agreement was entered into without duress, a fact his own mocking signature would attest to. We had it notarized by a clerk in a dusty office 2 towns over. I signed it with a steady hand. I made 3 copies. One went into a safe deposit box Amelia opened for me. Another was scanned and sent to a new, encrypted email account she created, with the password hidden in the spine of my favorite book of poetry. The original, the one with Leo's arrogant, swooping signature on the St. James Hotel letterhead, I tucked into a plain manila envelope. I went home and made Leo his favorite dinner, pan-seared scallops with risotto. He came home, kissed my cheek, and complimented the meal. He didn't notice the change in my eyes. He didn't see that I was no longer looking at him with fear, but with a quiet, patient calculation. I was no longer his victim. I was a cartographer, mapping out my escape. Over the next year, I lived a double life. Outwardly, I was the perfect, placid wife. I hosted his dinner parties, smiled at his jokes, and absorbed his little cruelties like a sponge. Inwardly, I was an archivist. A receipt for a hotel room on a night he was supposedly working late? Scanned, saved, and filed. A flirtatious text message from a colleague named M that flashed on his phone screen while he was in the shower? Photographed, uploaded, and logged. A cash withdrawal of $5,000 from our joint account that he never mentioned? Noted in a small, discreet journal I kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in my closet. Each piece of evidence was a stone, and I was building a foundation, not for a new house, but for a new life. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt calm, methodical. It was like I was tending to a garden, patiently weeding out the rot, preparing the soil for something new to grow. I started taking small pieces of myself back. I bought a new set of paints and started working on a canvas in the attic, a secret space that was entirely mine. I rejoined my book club, telling Leo the first was volunteering at the library. I started walking in the marshes again, breathing in the salty air, feeling the solid ground beneath my feet. With every secret act of self-preservation, I felt a little stronger, a little more real. The final piece fell into place 5 days before Christmas. I was in the hallway, carrying a tray of iced tea and lemon slices, when I heard Leo's voice from the living room. He was on the phone with his best friend, Mark. "Do you think she'll actually cry?" Mark's voice was slurred, thick with holiday cheer and cheap whiskey. I froze, my feet glued to the antique Persian runner. The glasses on the tray clinked softly. Leo's voice followed, light and smug. "Clara? She'll crumble. It'll be a scene. Mark, I'm telling you, she's so predictable. I bet you $100 she's sobbing before the appetizers are even cold." My breath caught in my throat. They were talking about me. About serving me divorce papers. At Christmas dinner. In front of my family. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was designed for maximum humiliation, a final, spectacular display of his power over me. I stood there for a long moment, the sound of my own heart roaring in my ears. I felt the old, familiar sting of shame. But then, something else washed over me. Not rage, not sorrow. It was a profound, chilling calm. He thought I was predictable. He thought he had written my final scene. He had no idea I had already finished the script. I quietly backed away, placed the tray in the kitchen, and went upstairs. I opened the closet, lifted the loose floorboard, and pulled out the small journal. I made one final entry. Then, I retrieved the manila envelope containing the notarized postnup. I wrapped it in beautiful, glittering gold paper and tied it with a crimson ribbon. I wrote a small gift tag, for Leo. I placed it under the Christmas tree, nestled amongst the other presents. It looked festive, almost joyful. A promise, not of an ending, but of a beginning. He had wagered on my tears. He was about to lose everything. The air in our dining room on Christmas Eve was thick with the scent of roasted pine, cinnamon, and impending doom. Only I could smell the latter. To everyone else, my sister Maya, her husband, Leo's parents, it was a picture of domestic bliss. Candles flickered in silver holders, casting a warm glow on the polished mahogany table. A magnificent prime rib, glistening with herbs, sat at the center, awaiting Leo's ceremonial carving. He stood at the head of the table, wearing a cashmere sweater I'd bought him for his birthday, looking every bit the benevolent patriarch. He caught my eye as I was pouring wine for his mother and gave me a small, conspiratorial smile. It was a look I knew well, the look of a predator who thinks his prey is cornered. I smiled back, a serene, placid smile that I had perfected over the past year. Let him have his moment. The best performances save the big reveal for the final act. Dinner was a slow, surreal waltz. I moved through the motions, a ghost at my own feast. I complimented my mother-in-law's cranberry sauce. I laughed at my brother-in-law's story about his misadventures with holiday lighting. My sister, Maya, sitting beside me, occasionally squeezed my hand under the table, a silent acknowledgement of the tension only she seemed to feel. As the main course plates were cleared, Leo tapped his wine glass with a knife. The light, cheerful chatter died down. If I could have everyone's attention for a moment, he began, his voice smooth as velvet. He looked directly at me, his eyes gleaming. This has been a wonderful year, full of changes. And in the spirit of new beginnings, I have something for my lovely wife. A few people murmured in anticipation. Maya gave me a hopeful look, likely expecting a surprise trip or a piece of jewelry. Leo reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a crisp, white, legal-sized envelope. He walked around the table and placed it on the tablecloth in front of me, right next to my water glass. His friend Mark, seated at the far end, coughed to hide a smirk. The table fell silent. The envelope felt cold and heavy, an omen in stark white. I picked it up, my movements deliberate and unhurried. I met Leo's gaze. He was watching me intently, his expression a smug mask of feigned sympathy. He was waiting for the crumble, for the tears he'd bet on. I slid my finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was a document. I didn't need to read past the first line, petition for dissolution of marriage. It was already signed by him. His lawyer's name was printed at the bottom. I let out a slow, quiet breath. I looked up at him, and I gave him the one thing he wasn't expecting. A small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Leo," I said, my voice soft but clear. The confusion that flickered across his face was more satisfying than any outburst could have been. The air grew thick with unspoken questions. I reached into my small evening bag, pulled out a sleek, silver fountain pen, and uncapped it with a soft click. Right there, at the Christmas table, with his family and mine as witnesses, I signed the divorce papers. I dated it neatly, then slid the document and the envelope back across the table to him. "There," I said. "All done." Leo just stared at me, dumbfounded. "That's it," he stammered, his bravado beginning to crack. "You're just signing it?" "Of course," I said gently. "But you seem to have forgotten my gift." I reached under my chair and lifted the beautifully wrapped, gold and crimson present. I placed it in the empty space where the divorce papers had been. "What's this?" he asked, his voice wary. "Your Christmas present," I replied. He looked around the table, a nervous energy beginning to radiate from him. He tore at the paper clumsily, revealing a simple leather document folder. He opened it. I watched his face as he read. I watched the color drain from his cheeks, his confident posture collapse as if his spine had turned to dust. His jaw went slack. He was reading the notarized post-nuptial agreement he had drunkenly scrawled on hotel stationery a year ago, the agreement that gave me 70% of everything. What is this?" his father asked, leaning forward to see. Leo couldn't speak. His eyes were wide with dawning horror. So I answered for him. "It's the agreement we both signed last year, Dad," I said, looking at my father-in-law. "We had it notarized. I believe Leo's lawyer will find it's quite ironclad, especially since Leo himself initiated the proceedings, which, as you can see, is the primary condition for its activation." Mark's jaw was hanging open. Leo's mother had a hand over her mouth. "But I filed first," Leo whispered, as if that were some magic spell that could undo his own signature. "Yes, you did," I said calmly. "Thank you for that. It simplified things immensely." And then I delivered the final line of my script. I reached into my purse one last time and pulled out a small, square envelope. I slid it across the table. It came to a stop next to his trembling hand. He looked at it as if it were a venomous snake. Slowly, he opened it. Inside was not a legal document. It was a photograph, a grainy black and white image of a tiny, perfect new life. A sonogram. He stared at the photo, then at me, his eyes filled with a wild, desperate confusion. "I'm pregnant, Leo," I said, my voice perfectly even. I placed a hand on my still flat stomach. 13 weeks. You're going to be a father. The room fell into a silence so profound I could hear the faint hiss of the candles. Leo looked from the sonogram to the postnup, the gears of his brilliant financial mind grinding to a halt as he finally understood the full scope of his miscalculation. The house, the portfolio, and now child support. He hadn't just lost a bet on my tears. He had lost his entire, carefully constructed kingdom. He looked at me, his face a mask of utter defeat. "You planned this," he choked out. I met his gaze, and for the first time in our marriage, I did not look away. I did not shrink. I did not apologize. "No, Leo," I said, and my voice was not vengeful, but filled with a quiet, unshakable truth. "You bet I'd cry. You called me predictable. You planned a tragedy. I simply prepared for a new life." I stood up from the table, my movements fluid and graceful. I turned to my sister, who was looking at me with tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of awe. "Maya," I said, my voice light, "would you mind helping me with the dessert? I believe we have apple pie." As we walked towards the kitchen, leaving Leo sitting amidst the wreckage of his own making, I didn't look back. The silence he had used as a weapon for so long was now his prison. And I, for the first time in years, was free. The aftermath was not a storm, but a quiet, steady rain. Leo was gone by morning. He didn't fight. He didn't even call. His lawyer, a man as slick and overconfident as Leo himself, tried to bluster and threaten, but Amelia, my Amelia, met his every move with a calm, unassailable wall of legal fact. The document was valid. The signature was his. The humiliation of having his own arrogance be the instrument of his downfall left him with no ground to stand on. He signed what he had to sign and vanished from Port Blossom, a ghost in the society he once ruled. The first few weeks were a strange mix of emptiness and liberation. The house on Camellia Lane was so quiet. At first, the silence felt deafening, a hollow space where the constant, low-grade hum of my anxiety used to be. But slowly, it transformed. It became peaceful. It became mine. I started with the small things. I bought sandalwood candles, the scent he'd always claimed to hate, and let their earthy fragrance fill every room. I painted the walls of what would be the nursery a soft, warm yellow, like morning sunshine. I played music while I cooked, loud, joyful music that I could sing along to without fear of judgment. I slept diagonally in the king-sized bed, my limbs spread wide, taking up all the space I wanted. Maya and Amelia became my pillars. They helped me pack up Leo's belongings, the tailored suits, the polished shoes, the entire collection of bourbon, and donate them. We didn't do it with anger, but with a sense of quiet ceremony, a cleansing. As we sealed the last box, Maya turned to me and said, "You have your light back, Clara." And I realized she was right. It wasn't a blazing bonfire, but a steady, warm glow that had started to burn from within. My daughter, whom I named Lily, was born in late spring, as the wisteria on the porch was exploding in a riot of purple blossoms. Holding her for the first time was not a moment of revelation, but of confirmation. It was the feeling of a final puzzle piece clicking into place. This was what I had been preparing for. This was the new life. Her presence filled the quiet house with a new kind of sound, soft coos, gentle gurgles, and eventually, peals of delighted laughter. The house was no longer a stage for a broken marriage. It was a sanctuary for a new family. I didn't stay on Camellia Lane. The house was too big, too full of ghosts. I sold it, along with all the trappings of my former life. With the proceeds, I bought a small, charming cottage by the marshes, with a wide, sun-drenched studio for my painting and a garden where Lily could play. It was a life built not on appearances, but on authenticity. Sometimes, walking along the marsh path with Lily asleep in her carrier, I think about Leo. I don't feel anger or bitterness. I feel a strange, distant pity for a man so trapped in his own ego that he couldn't see the value in the love he was so determined to crush. He thought strength was about control, about making others feel small. He never understood that true strength is quiet, resilient, and found in the courage to be gentle with yourself. My story doesn't end with a grand triumph or a dramatic confrontation. It ends here, in the quiet peace of an ordinary afternoon. It ends with the smell of salty air, the warmth of the sun on my face, and the steady, rhythmic beat of my daughter's heart against mine. Leo bet that I would cry, that I would crumble into a predictable ruin. He was wrong. I didn't crumble. I blossomed. If this story of calm power and perfect timing gave you chills, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when she slid that gold-wrapped box across the table. What was your favorite moment? Tell me in the comments below. For more stories of strength, smart revenge, and emotional justice, subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss a moment.